The dust motes in the setting sun were the only witnesses to the shame, illuminating a single battered K9 cage marked with the crushing indignity of a $1 price tag. A final, brutal dismissal of a life once sworn to loyalty, now deemed utterly worthless. You are about to witness the moment Sheriff Hayes, a man hardened by small-town justice, made an instinctive, irrational decision that would change not just his life, but the entire emotional trajectory of a young, grieving girl. Look closely at the dog's eyes as the sheriff approaches. Tired, yes, but holding an almost defiant spark of life that refuses to be extinguished by the neglect that surrounds it. This isn't just a rescue story. It is a profound testament to the truth that the most broken among us often hold the key to the deepest healing. Watch as two wounded souls, separated by species and circumstance, find each other in a miraculous moment of shared vulnerability, culminating in a little girl's reaction that stunned everyone who thought they understood the meaning of loss. This is the story of Copper, the abandoned K9, and Clara, the girl who taught him how to trust again. If you have ever felt completely discarded, left on the edge of the world where value is measured only in silence and neglect, then you understand the desolate picture painted in that rural auction yard as the sun bled out behind the dry horizon. Dust swirled like ghosts around the periphery, and amidst the scattered, unwanted debris sat a heavily worn, standard-issue K9 transport cage, seemingly forgotten by time and commerce, its wire mesh rusty and its bolted hinges whispering stories of countless long days now finished. It was an image of absolute finality, a stark monument to a life deemed utterly worthless, waiting for the cleanup crew to finally wipe it away forever. The only sign that this cage contained anything of consequence was a fragile white paper tag tied haphazardly to the latch, swinging faintly in the cooling evening breeze, marked simply and brutally, $1. You might think that such a trivial price tag could never hold the gravity of a life, yet that single dollar represented the final, humiliating verdict on the powerful, trained K9 curled weakly inside, a dog that had once sworn an oath of loyalty, now reduced to an unwanted object, a tragic, broken piece of inventory. Nobody was willing to claim or even notice in the chaos of closing deals and loud chatter. Sheriff Hayes, a man whose face held the indelible creases of small-town duty and too many silent nights, wasn't there to buy equipment or livestock. He was simply passing through the perimeter, his official vehicle kicking up the fine red dirt, ready to call it a day. But the quiet stillness radiating from that specific cage drew him in like a gravitational pull, forcing him to pause his routine, his steps slowing as he approached the abandoned structure. He didn't see junk. He saw the shadow of service and a spirit that, even when near exhaustion, still radiated a profound, almost stubborn dignity that demanded recognition, refusing to entirely surrender to the crushing weight of its circumstances. As he peered through the wires, seeing the dog's ribs defined against the sparse mat of fur, he knew immediately this was not just another stray, but a soul profoundly wounded by betrayal, yet his eyes, tired and sunken though they were, held a tiny, unmistakable flicker of something unbroken, a core of resilience that shocked the sheriff deeply. These are the moments, the quiet intersections, of deep despair and sudden irrational hope that define our community. And if you believe in the power of second chances, for animals and for people, then consider joining us on this journey by subscribing below, because true change always begins with recognizing value where others only see refuse. The sheriff lifted the tag gently, the rough texture of the paper contrasting sharply with the overwhelming weight of the decision suddenly thrust upon him, realizing that in this moment, the transaction wasn't about the monetary value but the spiritual cost of letting that flicker die. He understood the terrible irony. A dog, trained for rigorous duty, loyal beyond measure, now considered less valuable than a broken chair, a casualty of a system that often discards what it can no longer immediately profit from, failing to acknowledge the inherent worth of dedication and service until it is too late. There was no negotiation, no lengthy deliberation, only the raw, instantaneous recognition that leaving this K9 behind would be an indelible stain on his own moral compass, a failure to honor the silent contract all compassionate humans hold with the creatures who serve them. In one quiet, definitive breath, Sheriff Hayes reached into his worn leather wallet, pulled out a $1 bill that felt heavier than any 20, and declared that the forgotten life inside the cage was now claimed, a quiet act of redemption witnessed only by the setting sun and the swirling dust motes. The process of loading the heavy, silent cage into the back of the patrol cruiser was an arduous, humbling task, feeling less like transporting property and more like carrying a sleeping monument made of grief and steel, requiring immense physical effort that served as the immediate counterpoint to the dog's trivial purchase price. The K9 remained motionless, displaying a terrifying stillness that spoke volumes about how accustomed it had become to being ignored, demonstrating a level of resignation that cuts deeper than any outward display of violence, a silent acceptance of whatever fate was being dealt. The weight the sheriff felt wasn't just the physical burden of the cage, it was the heavy responsibility of reversing profound abandonment, understanding that he had not just acquired an animal, but inherited a complex psychological wound that would require far more than food and water to heal. He drove slowly out of the yard, the $1 left behind feeling like an insufficient offering for the immense trust he had just silently accepted, sensing that this seemingly simple purchase marked the beginning of something complicated and transformative for both of them. He realized in those quiet miles back toward the lights of town that he had done something entirely outside the strict boundaries of his badge and his routine, moved purely by an instinctual human desire to safeguard something vulnerable, recognizing that sometimes the most important legal duties are the ones not written down in the statute books, but etched onto the heart. The abandoned K9 represented a universal truth, that even the strongest among us can be left weak and broken when the structure of trust collapses entirely. The dog shifted faintly inside the cage, a barely perceptible movement that was the first sign of life the sheriff had truly witnessed, a small sound in the absolute quiet that sounded like a question, demanding to know what came next after the long darkness of being unwanted. The sheriff responded with a silent promise, the kind of commitment a person makes when they recognize a reflection of their own lonely struggles in the eyes of another being, understanding that they were now bound together by this shared history of quiet pain. He felt the immediate challenge of his new companion's situation. The dog needed medical attention, patience, and a safe harbor, but most importantly, it needed a reason to believe in humanity again after being so cruelly reminded of its disposable nature. The sheriff knew the municipal shelter staff would be confused by this unexpected arrival, especially given the history of the dog's condition, but he was prepared to defend his decision because he knew deep down this rescue was necessary for the moral health of the town itself. As the cruiser pulled into the dimly lit parking lot of the town's small functional animal facility, the sheriff braced himself for the skeptical questions and the logistical hurdles, knowing that the journey from $1 auction lot to loving home was long, fraught with uncertainty, and would begin with the daunting task of earning the trust of a K9 who had been taught that trust was a dangerous delusion. He just had to get the dog out of the cage and give him a name, a first step toward making him feel claimed again, which would be the focus of their confusing welcome at the shelter. The fluorescent lights of the small-town animal shelter cast a cold, unforgiving glare on the battered K9 cage as the sheriff carefully maneuvered it through the back entrance, instantly drawing the confused, wary gazes of the night staff who were used to routine calls. Not high-level police officers arriving with mysterious, heavily used working dogs. Their immediate reaction was a blend of respect for the uniform and deep concern for the animal's condition, the severity of which was immediately apparent under the harsh clinical light that revealed the dog's prominent skeletal structure and the dullness of his coat, physical markers of prolonged neglect that spoke to a deeper, unseen injury of the spirit. Questions hung thick in the air. Where did he come from, Sheriff? Is he violent? Questions that Sheriff Hayes waved off with a tired but firm hand, prioritizing the K9's immediate need for quiet space over bureaucratic explanation. Sensing the profound emotional tension emanating from the dog, who remained huddled in the corner, absorbing the new scents and sounds with a terrifying absolute silence. He simply explained that the dog was a rescue, recently retired, a gentle euphemism for discarded, and required a pen far from the other animals, where he could decompress without the overwhelming stimulation of a busy, echoing environment. The staff, accustomed to the sheriff's taciturn authority, begrudgingly complied, preparing a secluded isolation kennel that was cleaner and quieter than the common holding areas, understanding without words that this was not a standard intake, but a sensitive operation involving a wounded veteran of sorts. You could feel the collective uncertainty in the room, the shelter workers attempting to gauge whether this powerful, silent creature was a threat or just profoundly broken, relying on the sheriff's surprising commitment to this animal as the only guarantee of safety and purpose, realizing they were dealing with a deeply complex case of abandonment. It was only when the dog was settled, the steel door of the isolation pen securely fastened, that Sheriff Hayes finally knelt down on the cold concrete floor, ignoring the awkwardness of his uniform and the watchful eyes of the staff, positioning himself at eye level with the K9, choosing to communicate vulnerability rather than dominance. He didn't speak loudly, nor did he use commands. He spoke in a low, almost conversational tone, addressing the animal not as an official duty, but as one fellow, weary traveler acknowledging the burdens carried by another, creating an immediate, non-threatening intimacy. "You've had a rough go, haven't you, boy?" he murmured, the words sounding more like a quiet observation than a question, letting the K9 process the unfamiliar sound of genuine, unearned kindness, a language the dog had likely forgotten in the harsh reality of its recent past. The K9 didn't immediately respond with the traditional signs of canine greeting or fear. He simply held his gaze, a deep, knowing look passing between the human and the animal that transcended species and circumstance, revealing a mutual understanding of loneliness and the silent necessity of endurance. For a long moment, the only sound was the gentle whirring of the shelter's ventilation system, and the sheriff waited patiently, demonstrating a respect for the dog's personal space and trauma that was far more healing than any immediate medical intervention could have been, allowing the K9 to dictate the pace of their interaction. The dog's body remained rigid, locked in a protective tension, refusing to commit to trust, yet clearly listening to the cadence of the sheriff's voice, weighing the sincerity in his tone against the accumulated evidence of human failure. Then came the slightest movement, an almost imperceptible flick of a dark, velvety ear, the smallest possible acknowledgement of the sheriff's presence, like a tiny spark struggling to ignite in the cold void, offering a fragile hint of awareness. It was a movement that could easily be missed, a twitch, a flicker, but to the observing sheriff, it was a monumental gesture, a tiny crack in the dog's emotional fortress, proving that the light of awareness was not completely extinguished, only heavily shielded by pain. The sheriff smiled gently, a rare, genuine expression that softened the hard lines around his eyes, taking this minor response as permission to continue, understanding that he was navigating a minefield of past trauma where a sudden noise or ill-judged movement could shatter the delicate progress they had made. He knew that naming the dog was the next critical step in reclamation, the act of assigning identity being the first step in restoring belonging, shifting the K9 from being an it to a distinct he. "You look strong, like a penny," the sheriff mused aloud, his mind searching for a moniker that evoked resilience and earthiness, something solid that could anchor the dog in this new life, moving away from the operational codes or numbers that likely marked his previous existence. "Copper, that's what we'll call you. Copper, because you're tough and you deserve to shine again," sealing the name with the quiet conviction of a man making a serious, binding promise to a creature who desperately needed a patron. The word copper hung in the air, resonating slightly, and whether the dog understood the literal meaning was irrelevant. The K9 understood the intent, the sound vibrating with ownership and positive intent, a declaration that he was now recognized as an individual, not merely a discarded functionary. It was a baptism of hope, a small yet profound act of human connection aimed at mending the deep spiritual fracture caused by being abandoned and sold for a pittance in a desolate lot. Sheriff Hayes spent several more minutes simply sitting there, offering his quiet presence, a silent testament to the unwavering commitment he had instantly developed for the newly named Copper, allowing the dog to grow accustomed to the sight and scent of his rescuer without pressure or expectation. He hoped that this consistent, calm presence would slowly erode the fear and build the foundation of trust necessary for Copper to take his first hesitant steps toward rehabilitation and toward feeling claimed by someone again, knowing the road ahead would be long. He finally rose, stiffly pushing himself up from the floor, knowing he had done all he could for the evening, instructing the staff to simply ensure Copper had soft bedding, fresh water, and absolute quiet, reiterating the importance of patience. The sheriff left the shelter that night, feeling a deep, unfamiliar sense of anticipation, knowing that tomorrow he would begin the next difficult phase, introducing Copper to a world of kindness, an introduction that strangely would soon lead them both to a small farmhouse and a quiet little girl. The following weeks were a slow, deliberate dance of recovery for Copper, marked by careful veterinary attention, gradual weight gain, and the arduous, frustrating work of rebuilding a shattered faith in human touch, with Sheriff Hayes serving as the unwavering constant, visiting every day, not forcing interaction, but simply existing as a reliable, non-threatening presence. However, the sheriff knew that true healing rarely happens in the sterile environment of a kennel. It happens when purpose returns, and when the dog connects with a heart capable of understanding its particular breed of silent pain, a profound need for connection that the lonely officer himself couldn't fully satisfy. It was this deep-seated belief that spurred the sheriff's impromptu detour to the Miller family farmhouse, an unexpected professional visit about local zoning issues, but one which he used as a carefully calibrated opportunity to introduce Copper to a completely new, domestic environment, a world away from the auction yard and the isolation pen. The Miller family had recently suffered the heartbreaking loss of their beloved golden retriever, a dog that had been the anchor of their small homestead for over a decade, and the air around the property still felt heavy with the specific, echoing emptiness that only the absence of a cherished pet can create. As Sheriff Hayes pulled the patrol truck into the dusty turnaround, gently unlatching Copper's transport harness and giving the K9 a quiet, encouraging nod, the gravity of the introduction weighed heavily on him, realizing he was gambling with the dog's fragile trust by exposing him to new people and overwhelming stimuli. Copper stepped out hesitantly, his trained body still moving with a certain economy, but his eyes scanning the property with a mixture of professional caution and genuine fear, the memory of past betrayals still lurking close to the surface, ready to retreat at the first sign of hostility. The Miller parents, aware of their daughter's fragile emotional state following her loss, stepped out onto the porch, initially anticipating that the sight of any new dog, especially a large, clearly scarred K9, would trigger an immediate retreat, or perhaps a fresh bout of quiet grief from their 10-year-old Clara. Clara, generally a reserved and observant child, was already standing near the railing, her small frame cloaked in a familiar, protective sadness, watching the unfamiliar dog's hesitant arrival with an intensity that surprised her mother and father, her usual shyness completely overridden by an unexplainable curiosity. Instead of retreating as her parents mentally prepared for, Clara took a single, slow step off the porch and onto the grass, her movements almost agonizingly deliberate, her eyes locked onto Copper's, demonstrating a profound, instinctive recognition that bypassed the usual childlike enthusiasm and went straight to a deeper, more empathetic place. She didn't rush, she didn't call out, and she didn't attempt to lure him with treats. She approached the massive dog with the quiet reverence one offers to a profoundly wounded warrior, realizing intuitively that any sudden action would frighten this deeply scarred soul. You could see the subtle but intense trembling in her small hands, held loosely at her sides, a physical manifestation of the immense emotional courage it took for her to cross that distance, to offer connection despite her own pain, her vulnerability mirroring Copper's own guardedness. Her approach was not driven by the desire for a new pet, but by an instantaneous, powerful impulse to acknowledge the shared burden of loss that seemed to emanate visibly from the canine's posture, creating an immediate, unspoken kinship that defied all logic. Copper, The battle-worn K9, who had resisted weeks of gentle coaxing and professional attempts at bonding, halted abruptly as Clara drew near, his head lowering slightly, his powerful body maintaining a perfect, tense stillness that allowed him to assess the child's intent without committing to either defense or acceptance. This was his critical test, the moment where he had to decide if he had enough trust left in his spirit to offer to a small, vulnerable human, a choice made complicated by his history of being used and then discarded without care. The air around them seemed to thicken and shift, palpable with suppressed emotion. The parents holding their breath on the porch, the sheriff remaining perfectly still by the truck, and Copper and Clara locked in this silent, momentous standoff where the fate of two wounded hearts hung in the balance. It was a moment of profound, quiet truth, where all the complex adult worries about liability and logistics evaporated, leaving only the raw, pure connection of two beings standing on the precipice of understanding. Then, with an almost agonizingly slow movement that spoke volumes about the depth of his internal conflict, Copper lowered his massive head further, almost to the height of the child's outstretched hand, an instinctive and profound gesture of submission and tentative offering, communicating that he recognized something safe and true in her aura. It was an unspoken invitation, a fragile sliver of trust extended across the chasm of their respective traumas, acknowledging that she was not a threat, but perhaps something essential, a source of quiet solace. The sheriff watched, momentarily stunned by the speed and intimacy of this silent exchange, realizing that he, a man who dealt in facts and evidence, was witnessing a pure, undeniable miracle of intuitive connection that bypassed all logical pathways. The dog, who had treated every adult with careful distance, had instantly offered a measure of trust to this grieving child that he hadn't yet offered to his rescuer, suggesting that Clara's profound empathy was the exact medicine Copper had been waiting for all along. This was more than just a meeting, it was the start of an instantaneous, necessary spiritual transaction where one soul desperately needed to give comfort and the other needed desperately to receive it without judgment. They had found each other across the landscape of grief, proving that the deepest connections are often formed not in joy, but in the shared recognition of pain, setting the stage for the profound healing that was about to unfold in the stillness of the farmhouse yard. Clara didn't flinch when Copper lowered his head. Instead, she accepted the profound gesture of vulnerability, with the solemnity of someone who understands the value of a hard-won peace offering, slowly sinking down onto the cool, lush grass of the farmhouse yard, making herself small and non-threatening beside the large K9. She settled herself comfortably, pulling her knees up to her chest, and without ever looking back at the adults watching from the porch, she began to speak in a voice barely above a whisper, her words weaving a delicate tapestry of grief, memory, and simple, profound connection that instantly drew Copper into her orbit. Her monologue was not the usual cooing or commanding often directed at animals. It was a sharing of her own profound, echoing sadness, a confession of the deep physical ache left behind by her old dog, whom she referred to simply as Buddy. She spoke of the empty space beside her bed, the uncomfortable silence of rooms that used to resonate with the sound of paws, and the unsettling heaviness of nights she could no longer bear to sleep through, essentially narrating the internal map of her own wounded heart to the silent, receptive K9 beside her. Copper responded to this steady flow of quiet, honest emotion, not with a show of alertness or duty, but with a deep, weary sigh that seemed to release weeks of held tension, finally allowing himself to relax his stiff posture and sink completely onto the grass, his massive frame folding gently beside the child. He rested his chin on his outstretched paws, positioning himself so close that his rough fur brushed against the fabric of her jeans, signaling a profound, unexpected surrender to the safety her presence offered, finding in her sorrow a strange, anchoring sense of familiarity and peace. This instantaneous, almost magnetic bond between the grieving child and the abandoned service dog, two souls who had both suffered the agony of essential loss, was a sight that transfixed the sheriff and the Miller parents, leaving them speechless in the doorway. If you have ever witnessed a moment where two disparate lives suddenly clicked into perfect focus, recognizing their shared spiritual blueprint, tell us in the comments below. What unexpected connection or rescue changed the way you view the world, reminding you that healing often comes in the most surprising forms? Clara paused her quiet narrative, and as if acknowledging the truth she had just spoken, Copper's tail gave a single uncertain thump against the soft turf, a sound small enough to be easily missed, yet monumental in its emotional significance, the first genuine sign of relaxed, non-functional contentment the sheriff had witnessed in the K9 since the auction. The tentative thump quickly gained confidence, finding a slow, steady rhythm against the ground, a heartbeat of restored hope that resonated deeply with the silent audience observing this miraculous private exchange. The sheriff, leaning against the doorframe, found himself blinking back unexpected emotion, realizing that all his professional training, his careful handling, and his attempts to nurture the dog back to health had achieved less in weeks than this small, intuitive girl had accomplished in mere minutes, proving that mechanical care is no substitute for pure, unvarnished empathy. He saw clearly that Copper wasn't responding to treats or commands. He was responding to the absolute, vulnerable authenticity emanating from Clara. Clara, completely absorbed in the intimate space she had created, reached out a hand, not to pet the dog aggressively, but to lay it gently on the rough patch of fur above Copper's shoulder, a light touch that was respectful and undemanding, communicating safety and acceptance. Copper did not flinch. Instead, he leaned into the pressure, accepting the small weight of her touch as if it were the most natural and necessary thing in the world, allowing her to bear the slightest portion of his immense burden of loneliness. The parents, who had prepared themselves for tears and difficult emotions, exchanged looks of profound astonishment and gratitude, witnessing their daughter's sadness being channeled not into withdrawal, but into this powerful reciprocal act of healing. Clara wasn't asking Copper to replace Buddy. She was simply offering him shelter in her own sorrow, giving him a safe place to grieve and, in turn, finding herself less alone in her own painful journey of processing loss, realizing that deep connection often requires only shared silence and presence. Copper's breathing became audibly steadier, deeper, settling into the slow, rhythmic pattern of a creature finally safe and unburdened, the visible tension melting from his powerful jawline, allowing his eyes to close briefly in profound rest. For the first time since the sheriff had found him, the dog was not merely resting, he was actively relaxing, anchored firmly by the small, quiet girl nestled beside him, demonstrating the immediate, powerful, transformative effect of unconditional acceptance. The sheriff recognized the fundamental truth of the scene. They were not two broken creatures attempting to fix each other, but two necessary pieces interlocking perfectly, filling voids that the world had painfully carved out of them both. The girl needed someone to whisper her pain to without judgment, and the dog needed someone whose hands carried only solace, not commands or betrayal. Watching Clara stroke Copper's flank with such unforced tenderness, the sheriff knew that the $1 he had paid was merely the cost of transportation. The true value of the dog was now being measured in the precious millimeters of space, gained between fear and trust, between grief and recognition. This was the moment the K9 stopped being the abandoned dog and started becoming an essential participant in a family's recovery. This silent, sun-drenched interaction concluded with Clara whispering one last secret into Copper's ear, a secret only the two of them would share, before she lifted her head, ready to face the world again, subtly changed by the recognition that she had a mission far bigger than her own sadness, a mission that required her to fully embrace this unexpected, gentle giant. The gentle silence that had settled over the farmhouse yard was finally broken as Clara lifted her head from Copper's sturdy shoulder. The weight of her shared confession momentarily lifted, and when her eyes met the warm sunlight filtering through the trees, they were no longer glazed with the dull film of perpetual sadness. Instead, they shone with a startling clarity, possessing an intense, focused light that spoke not of the pain of recent loss, but of the sudden, joyous realization of profound spiritual reunion, a recognition that transcended simple human-animal companionship. She looked at Copper, then back at her parents and the sheriff, her expression radiant with an emotion that was less about acquiring a new pet and more about recovering a missing piece of herself, as if she had been searching for something vital and had finally found it lying patiently beside her in the grass. This was the moment the emotional landscape completely changed, the air clearing of lingering sorrow and filling instead with an undeniable quiet sense of restorative destiny, acknowledging that some connections are simply inevitable and necessary for survival. With a final, decisive movement that cemented their bond, Clara wrapped her arms fully around Copper's neck, not tentatively, but with the complete, unreserved commitment of a child claiming something precious and essential, burying her face into his coarse, warm fur. The embrace was instantaneous and absolute, a declaration of loyalty and acceptance that required no verbal articulation, closing the emotional loop that had begun the moment the dog stepped off the sheriff's truck. The once abandoned canine, who had been stiff and unresponsive to human touch for weeks, responded instantly and fully to her embrace, leaning his entire weight into the small child, a massive, powerful surrender that showed a willingness to accept her complete dominion over his emotional well-being. He chose her in that instant without hesitation, trusting her small arms to hold him together, confirming that the intuition of a grieving child was the only true measure of his safety and value. The parents on the porch could no longer hold back their emotion, and the sight of their daughter, finally liberated from the suffocating grip of her bereavement, tears now tracing paths down her cheeks, but tears of pure, unadulterated release and relief, brought them forward, moving quietly off the porch and closer to the unfolding miracle. If this transformation, this quiet moment of healing between a child and a dog, touches your heart, please take a second to hit the like button and share this story of second chances with someone who needs a little hope today. Sheriff Hayes watched the tableau with an overwhelming feeling of humility, stepping back entirely from the scene, realizing with perfect clarity the true, far-reaching impact of his $1 investment. He hadn't merely saved a dog from a cage, nor had he acquired a new companion for himself. He had served as an unintentional messenger, delivering the precise, essential, and irreplaceable piece of comfort required to mend a child's broken spirit. He was merely the catalyst, the conduit through which fate had operated. He realized that Copper's future lay not in police work or rigorous duty, but in the quiet, steady devotion of family life, serving the sacred purpose of anchoring a human heart, a duty far more important than any official operation. The dog was finally home, not in a professional kennel, but within the secure, loving boundary of Clara's embrace, fulfilling a destiny that only true connection could provide, a destiny to be loved and to love unconditionally. The family slowly converged around the girl and the dog, forming a tight, protective circle, confirming the unspoken decision that Copper was already, irrevocably, one of them. No paperwork or formalities required, simply accepted into the fold of the Miller farm and their quiet, loving life. The scars on Copper's body and the sadness in Clara's eyes were not erased, but they were redefined, transformed into shared markers of survival and resilience, woven into the fabric of their new shared history. Everyone present, the sheriff, the parents, and perhaps most profoundly Copper himself, witnessed the quiet miracle taking shape, seeing how genuine, profound connection operates outside the transactional, demanding framework of the modern world, proving that vulnerability is often the quickest path to healing and belonging. The universe had taken two beings defined by loss and brought them together to teach each other the enduring power of faith and quiet devotion. The image of Clara and Copper, inseparable and serene, became the sheriff's profound, lasting reward, the most meaningful arrest he would ever make being the arrest of the deep, lingering sadness that had gripped the Miller family. He recognized that this unexpected partnership was a testament to the fact that rescue is often mutual, and the most broken things often possess the most potent capacity to heal others. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and soft purples, a sense of profound completeness settled over the yard, replacing the dusty desolation of the auction lot and the cold tension of the shelter, suggesting that the path of true value is rarely straight and often requires searching in the darkest corners for the truest, most valuable lights. The sheriff knew his duty was done here. leaving the new family to their quiet, hard-won reunion, carrying with him the profound lesson that courage is often found in small hands, and unconditional love is most eloquently expressed in the quiet thumps of a contented tail, a testament to the enduring power of a single dollar spent on a life worth saving. Now, he needed to share this incredible story with others who might be losing hope. We often search for grand interventions and dramatic shifts to define the moments that change us, but as we've seen in the quiet, sun-drenched yard of the Miller farmhouse, the most profound transformations often occur in the space between two shared breaths, in the silent offering of a small, trembling hand, and the massive, weary surrender of a powerful canine. This story, rooted in the tragic premise of abandonment, blossoms into an extraordinary confirmation that worth is never determined by a price tag or a previous failure, but by the courage to remain open to connection, even after suffering the deepest betrayals. Clara didn't just meet a new dog. She met the mirror image of her own profound emptiness, and by pouring her grief into him, she began to stitch herself back together. Remember the truth woven into Copper's journey. That resilience is not the absence of scars, but the willingness to accept love despite them, proving that the act of giving comfort is often the most effective way to receive it. Sheriff Hayes may have paid $1, but the return on that investment was immeasurable, calculated in the steady thump of a grateful tail and the restored light in a little girl's eyes. Never underestimate the power of a single act of radical kindness, for it possesses the inherent ability to set off a chain reaction of healing that can revitalize entire communities. Find your own copper, recognize the silent value in the discarded, and always choose the path of empathy over indifference. The true miracle isn't the rescue, it's the beautiful, enduring realization that love can find its way home from any distance.